The European Court of Human Rights is founded for the purpose of protecting democracy and human rights. The preamble of the convention is very clear on that. But the court should make a distinction between those countries which are governed by democracy, which are governed by the rule of law, and those countries which are not governed by democracy and where the rule of law does not prevail. Because if the rule of law does not prevail, setting up commissions, setting up new legal remedies is meaningless. It's totally meaningless. It serves only one purpose. It delays the time span to go to the European Court of Human Rights. And in these cases, I'm disappointed with the court, and I must say that the court has not acted in accordance with the founding principles of the court, that is, to protect democracy and human rights, because the court is a constitutional court of Europe. If it's a constitutional court, then it should act like a constitutional court. It should go into the political context of the case. And it can do so. It has the means to do so. Why? Because if the domestic remedy, first of all, is not effective, you don't have to exhaust domestic remedies. The court says, if there are special circumstances, you don't have to exhaust domestic remedies. Well, if there is no rule of law in one country, don't you think this is a special circumstance? I think this is a very special circumstance, in fact. And the court can do something else. If there is a pattern of practice, of repeated violations in a certain pattern, and if there is government's tolerance towards these violations, then there is administrative practice. The court can decide that there is administrative practice. Once it decides there is administrative practice, you are absolved from the obligation to exhaust domestic remedies. So, I mean, the court can make a distinction between those countries where democracy and rule of law prevail and those countries where they don't prevail.
Where you include Turkey.
Including Turkey. Very much so. And should be more, perhaps, flexible about exhausting domestic remedies in those countries. It's very clear. Article 64 of the Convention states very explicitly that the judgments are binding and the governments have undertaken to execute execute the judgments. You cannot say, I will not execute the judgment. Now it is up to the governments, of course, to enforce the judgment. It is the Committee of Ministers who is responsible for the execution of judgments, but also at bilateral levels, whether the governments will use their influence, that is to say, European Union, and at bilateral level, at the European governments. Whether they will say...
How can they use their influence?
Well, I mean, they can say you have to apply the convention. You have to execute the judgment. You cannot. It's binding. You have a commitment, and you are living in a group of democratic states. You belong to a democracy, a club of democracies. So you have to, in a club of democracies, you have to play by the rules.
But if he doesn't?
Well, I mean, that of course is a very critical question, if he doesn't. It is binding on all governments. So the execution is not only a question for the Turkish government, it's a question for all 47 governments which have adhered to the convention, which are contracting states.
But that's an interesting scenario.
Yeah, I mean, that is, of course, I mean, it is also related to the question, what is the role of human rights in foreign policy? What weight the governments give to human rights in their foreign policy? Is it a part of their foreign policy, or it is a lip service? That I think is interesting to see.
So what could the other 46 countries then do?
Well, 46 countries can do well. It's not business as usual if you don't execute the judgment. There are many ways. There are many ties between Turkey and European countries. I mean, there are bilateral ties, and there are multilateral institutional ties. I mean, Council of Europe, of course, Parliamentary Assembly, the Committee of Ministers. They can, of course, the Secretary General Jagland. They can, of course, exert an influence. And the governments collectively and at bilateral level, they can say, well, I mean, if you don't do that, then I mean, this is not rule of law. So,
what can
well, sanctions economic. Well, Turkey economically is very vulnerable now. It's very vulnerable now. That is also a point which should be kept in mind, perhaps.
What can the General Secretary Thorbjørn Jagland do in the situation now?
Jagland always says, well, I'm talking to Mr. Erdogan behind the doors, it is much more. Well, there is always this dilemma when you are dealing with an authoritarian country. There is always this dilemma. If you pursue an appeasement policy, then the authoritarian country gets away with violations of human rights. I mean, it doesn't pay a price. On the other hand, if you say that I'm protecting the principles, so I will put pressure and I'll say that you cannot be member of the Club of Democracies, then if you exclude, then you don't have leverage. If you sever ties, then you don't have leverage. So it is, you know, there should be, it's a very careful balance. I mean,
it's a difficult situation.
It's a difficult situation. But what is important?
What do you recommend Jagland to do?
Jagland should not say always that I'm talking to him behind the doors. In this way, I'm more influential. I think Jagland, as a Secretary General, should go to the public and declare his position, because, I mean, the talking behind the doors, judging by the result, is not so far has been very effective. It is really a question of whether human rights and the court's judgment is part of the foreign policy or not. Whether they give priority to this, or the priority is always narrow self-interest. That I think is important. I mean, the court has been criticized very heavily, very severely, in many circles in Europe. I mean, only in Berlin, I have attended 4 different conferences, all on the same subject: whether a human rights court is an effective remedy for Turkey or not. So there has been heavy criticism. That is one element, I think. And then, of course, one should not forget, if only one country says that you should abide by the court's judgment, perhaps this doesn't carry much weight. But if there's a collective action, it has a cumulative effect. It is a cumulative effect. It's a collective responsibility, I think. The execution of the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, I think it's a collective responsibility. It is not the responsibility of one country or one body of the Council of Europe, but I think it's a very collective responsibility, because it is, as I said, the Constitutional Court. It's a public order of Europe, I think, which is at issue.